The year was 1878, and the sun over the New Mexico territory did not shine so much as it hammered down upon the earth, intent on flattening everything into submission. Red Mesa was a town built of grit, timber, and an unearned optimism, sitting precariously on the edge of the civilized world like a blister waiting to burst. To the east lay the respectable settlements with their church bells and painted fences. To the west lay the deep, bleeding canyons and the lands that the maps claimed were territories, but the wind knew belonged to the Apache, the Navajo, and the Cheyenne. Red Mesa itself was a study in segregation. The main street was wide enough for a 6-horse stagecoach to turn around, flanked by boardwalks that thumped under the boots of cowboys, prospectors, and soldiers from the nearby fort. There was a distinct line, invisible but harder than iron, that separated the white businesses from the adobe structures where the Mexicans lived, and further out, the makeshift camps of the displaced natives who refused to go to the reservation. In the back of a cramped kitchen attached to the Golden Spur, a saloon that pretended to be a restaurant during the daylight hours, Abigail Sloane wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. She was 26 years old, though the mirror, if she had owned one that wasn't cracked down the middle, would have told her she looked 30. The heat of the wood stove had baked a permanent flush into her cheeks, not the rosy glow of a debutante, but the ruddy burn of a woman who lived her life within arm's reach of a fire. Abby was what the townspeople called plain. It was a word that carried the weight of a stone. Her hair was a color that could not decide between brown and gray, pulled back severely to keep it out of the food. Her hands were not soft, they were wide, the knuckles enlarged from scrubbing pots and kneading dough, the skin rough as parchment. She had lost her parents 5 years ago to the yellow fever that had swept through the settlement like a scythe in a wheat field. They had been homesteaders, good people with bad luck, leaving her with nothing but a mountain of medical bills and a stubborn refusal to die. "More biscuits, Sloane, and burn them less than the last batch, or I will dock your pay." The voice belonged to Mr. Henderson, the owner of the saloon. He was a man who sweated grease and counted pennies as if they were gold coins. "Yes, Mr. Henderson," Abby replied, her voice steady. She did not shout. She never shouted. She learned long ago that noise only attracted attention, and attention was rarely kind to a woman with no dowry, no beauty, and no protector. She pulled the tray from the oven. The biscuits were perfect, golden brown and rising high, smelling of butter and yeast. Cooking was the one thing Abby knew she could do better than anyone in Red Mesa. It was her currency. It was the reason she had a roof over her head, however leaky that roof might be. Out in the dining room, the lunch crowd was thinning out. It was mostly men, as it always was. Miners with dust in their beards, soldiers looking for a reprieve from the barracks, and the local cattle hands. Abby pushed through the swinging door, balancing a tray of stew bowls. The stew was her specialty venison, slow-cooked with wild onions, carrots, and a blend of herbs she gathered herself from the foothills. As she placed a bowl down in front of a young cowboy, he looked up, his eyes scanning her face with a dismissal that stung more than a slap. "Thank you, darlin'," he said, his tone mocking. He turned to his friend. "You know, if she could cook a face onto herself as good as she cooks this meat, she might have found a husband by now." The friend laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Careful, Jeb. You might hurt her feelings, and she will spit in your beans." "Who would marry that?" a third man interjected, leaning back in his chair. "She is built like a plow horse and has a face like a long winter—" Abby's face remained impassive. She had heard it all before. She had heard worse. She focused on the table, wiping away a ring of water left by a glass. "I am not pretty," she told herself, repeating the mantra that had kept her sane since she was 16. "But I am useful. Usefulness buys bread. Beauty only buys trouble." She retreated to the kitchen, her sanctuary. Through the gap in the door, she saw the heavy wooden doors of the saloon swing open. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the casual chatter dying down to respectful murmurs. Silas McGraw had entered. McGraw was the king of Red Mesa, or so he believed. He owned the largest cattle ranch in the county, but his true ambition lay in iron and steam. He was the representative for the Pacific Railroad Company, a man who saw the land not as soil and rock, but as a grid of potential profits. He was a large man, his waistline expanding with his wealth, dressed in a suit that cost more than Abby would earn in 10 years. Flanking him was Sheriff Boone Carver. Carver was a man of sharp angles and a sharper temper, his tin star pinned to a chest that puffed out with self-importance. He was deeply in debt to McGraw, a fact that everyone knew but no one spoke of aloud. The survey team says the pass through the Red Canyons is the only viable route, McGraw was saying, his voice booming as he took his reserved table in the corner. We need those savages moved out before the 1st of the month. The treaty protects that valley. Silas, a voice ventured from the bar. Dr. Evans, the town physician, a weary man who drank too much whiskey to forget the limbs he had sawed off during the war. Treaties are paper, Sheriff Carver spat, hooking his thumbs into his gun belt. Progress is steel. Besides, they are just squatters. 2 Moons and his gang of half-breeds and runaways are a threat to decent Christian folks. Abby paused in her chopping. 2 Moons. The name sent a ripple of cold dread through the room, even amidst the heat. Rafe. 2 Moons. The most feared man in the territory. Abby had never seen him up close, but she knew the stories. Everyone did. They said he was the son of a white trader and a Cheyenne warrior woman. They said he had been a scout for the army until he led a platoon into an ambush or saved them from one, depending on who was telling the tale. He had turned his back on the white world and the native world alike, carving out his own existence in the high country. They said he could shoot the wings off a fly at 50 paces. They said he stole children. They said he was a demon in human skin. If 2 Moons interfere with the railroad, McGraw said, slicing into his steak with vicious precision, then we will hang him. It is as simple as that. Abby turned back to her work. The affairs of powerful men were like thunderstorms. It was best to keep your head down and wait for them to pass. Her shift ended at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Her legs ached, and her apron was stained with gravy and flour. She collected her pay from Mr. Henderson, 50 cents for the day. It was barely enough to buy grain for her horse and a meager supper for herself. But she had a routine. She gathered the leftovers from the day's cooking, the burnt ends of the brisket, the slightly stale biscuits, the bottom of the stew pot that the customers wouldn't pay for. Mr. Henderson allowed her to take it, mostly because it saved him the trouble of feeding it to the pigs. Abby loaded the pots into her small, rickety wagon parked in the alleyway. Her horse, a gelding named Buster, who was older than she was and blind in one eye, nickered softly when he smelled her. I know, Buster, I know, she whispered, stroking his velvet nose. It is hot. We will go home soon. Home was a generous word for the single room she rented above the livery stable on the edge of town. It smelled of hay and manure, but it was hers, or it would be, if she could pay the rent. She led the wagon not toward the livery, but toward the shadowy alleyways behind the Chinese laundry and the blacksmith's shop. This was where the people who were not welcome on the main street gathered. A woman stepped out from the shadows. She was Navajo, her clothes worn but mended with careful stitching. She held a small bundle in her hands. Abby, the woman said softly. Her English was broken, but clear. Hello? Yazi, Abby replied. She ladled a generous portion of the thick stew into the tin pail Yazi held out, and added 3 biscuits. Yazi handed over the bundle. Inside were dried sage and a small pouch of medicinal roots. It was not a purchase. It was a trade, a survival pact. You are good, Yazi said, her dark eyes searching Abby's face. My heart is good. My heart is tired. Yazi, Abby admitted with a small, sad smile. Hey! The shout came from the end of the alley. A man, one of the stable hands, was leaning against the wall, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Look at that, he sneered. The ugly duckling feeding the strays. You an Indian lover. Sloan, you like the smell of them. Abby stiffened. She did not look at the man. She finished packing up her pots, her hands shaking slightly. "Go, Yazi," she whispered. The native woman vanished into the shadows as if she were made of smoke. Abby climbed onto the seat of her wagon and clicked her tongue at Buster. As she rolled past the stable hand, he spat again, the brown liquid landing on the wheel of her wagon. "You keep company with trash. You're gonna get thrown out with the trash," he called after her. Abby kept her eyes forward. Sticks and stones, she thought. Sticks and stones. She arrived at the livery stable and unhitched Buster, brushing him down despite her exhaustion. As she climbed the stairs to her room, she found Mrs. Higgins, the landlady, waiting at the top. Mrs. Higgins was a woman who looked like a dried apple doll, all wrinkles and sourness. "You are late with the rent, Abigail." "I have part of it." "Mrs. Higgins," Abby said, reaching into her pocket to pull out the coins she had earned, plus $1 she had saved from selling a quilt her mother had made. "I have $1.50. I will have the rest by Friday." "You owe me $4. Mrs. Higgins snapped. "I have a man from the mining company asking about this room. He will pay $5 cash. If you do not have the full amount by the day after tomorrow, you are out. You and your pots and that glue factory horse." "Please, Mrs. Higgins," Abby pleaded, her voice tight. "I have nowhere else to go." "That is not my problem. This is a business, not a charity ward for spinsters." "Mrs. Higgins snatched the coins from Abby's hand and stomped down the stairs. Abby entered her room and closed the door, leaning her back against it. She slid down until she hit the floor, burying her face in her hands. The room was stiflingly hot. Her entire worldly possessions were here: a trunk of clothes, her mother's Bible, a set of cast-iron skillets, and the small stash of coins she had just handed over. She was drowning. She was working herself to the bone, swallowing her pride every single day. And yet she was sinking. "If you were pretty," a treacherous voice in her head whispered. "You could work at the saloon bar instead of the kitchen. You could make $20 a week in tips. Or you could catch the eye of a rancher." Abby shook her head violently. She stood up and went to the small basin to wash her face. She would not cry. Crying wasted water and salt, and she could afford neither. She went to the window that overlooked the main street. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and bruised orange. That was when the silence fell. It started at the far end of town and rolled forward like a wave. The chatter of the people on the boardwalk ceased. The piano in the saloon stopped abruptly. Even the dogs seemed to stop barking. Abby peered through the dusty glass. A group of 6 riders was entering the town. They rode in a loose formation, but there was a discipline to it, a predatory grace. The horses were fine animals, mustangs with strong chests and intelligent eyes, not the broken-down nags usually seen in town. The riders were a mix of humanity that defied categorization. There was a Mexican vaquero with silver spurs that caught the dying light, a massive black man with a shotgun resting easily across his saddle, 2 Cheyenne warriors with feathers in their hair but wearing cavalry trousers, and a young white boy who looked no older than 18, looking nervous. But it was the man in the lead who stole the air from the street. He rode a large bay stallion that stepped with high, silent hooves. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a duster coat that had been bleached pale by the sun. His hair was dark, thick, and long, pulled back and tied at the nape of his neck, revealing a face that seemed carved from granite. His skin was the color of bronze, a testament to his mixed blood. He wore a necklace of bone and turquoise over his shirt, and a Colt revolver hung low on his hip, the handle worn smooth from use. Rafe. 2 moons. He did not look left or right. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, dark and impenetrable. There was no bravado in his posture, no swagger. It was the stillness of a wolf that knows it is the apex predator. Abby felt a shiver run down her spine. But it was not fear. It was something else. Recognition. He was an outcast, a man caught between 2 worlds, belonging to neither, hated by both. As he passed below her window, he suddenly looked up. It was as if he had felt her gaze. For a second, less than a heartbeat, his eyes locked onto hers through the dirty glass. His expression did not change. There was no smile, no sneer, just a flat, assessing look that stripped away the walls and the distance. He saw her, in a town where people looked through her, or looked at her with disdain. Rafe Two Moons simply saw her. Then he looked away, facing forward again. The group rode toward the general store, dismounting with fluid ease. The town let out a collective breath, and the murmurs began. Fearful and excited. Did you see his eyes? That is the devil himself. Hide your daughters. Abby stepped back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at her rough hands, then back at the figure of the man disappearing into the store. She was the rejected woman, the one not worth a second glance. He was the feared man, the one everyone watched but no one understood. Two ghosts haunting the same dusty street. Abby went to her small stove in the corner of the room. She needed to bake bread for the morning. She needed to survive, but as she reached for the flour, her hands were trembling. The sun had set, but the air in Red Mesa had suddenly become electric, charged with the promise of a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. She lit her kerosene lamp, the small flame flickering against the encroaching dark. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the canyons, whispering of change, of danger, and of a destiny that was riding into town on the back of a bay stallion. Abby Sloan did not know it yet, but the walls of her small, safe, miserable life were about to come down, and the man who would bring them down was the one man she had been warned to fear above all others. She poured the water into the flour and began to knead, the rhythm familiar and soothing. But tonight, the dough felt different under her fingers. It felt like a possibility. The Saturday market in Red Mesa was a chaotic tapestry of noise and color, stitched together by the relentless heat of the morning sun. Dust rose in choking clouds from the hooves of horses and the wheels of wagons, settling on the skin like a second layer of clothing. For Abigail Sloan, the market was not a place of leisure. It was a battlefield. She had positioned her small, weathered wagon at the far edge of the plaza, where the shade of the cottonwood trees did not reach. It was the only spot allowed for her away from the respectable storefronts, next to the few Native American women who sat on blankets selling woven baskets and turquoise beads. These women were silent, their eyes downcast, tolerated only as long as they remained invisible. Abby felt a kinship with them that she dared not speak aloud. On the wooden counter of her wagon, she had arranged her morning's labor. There were 3 heavy iron pots of venison stew, the steam rising in fragrant plumes that smelled of sage and wild onions. Beside them sat rows of golden cornbread muffins and 2 apple pies with crusts as flaky as dry leaves. "Fresh stew," Abby called out, her voice clear but lacking the boisterous confidence of the other hawkers. "Hot cornbread." A group of men, idle and smelling of last night's whiskey, lounged against the railing of the saloon across the dirt road. They watched her with eyes that held no kindness. "Look at that," one of them sneered, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Abby Sloan is out early, trying to earn enough coin to buy a mirror that lies to her." The others laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "She is not selling stew," another man said, hitching up his gun belt. "She is selling desperation. Hey, Sloan, how much stew do I have to buy to get you a husband? 50 gallons? Abby stiffened, her hand tightening on the ladle until her knuckles turned white. She did not look at them. She focused on a fly buzzing near the pie. Ignore them, she told herself. Coins do not have ears. A woman walked past a pillar of Red Mesa society named Mrs. Sterling. She was dressed in stiff blue calico, holding the hand of her young daughter, a girl with ribbons in her hair. The little girl pointed at Abby's wagon. "Mama, that smells good." "Mrs." Sterling yanked the girl's arm, pulling her toward the center of the plaza. She spoke in a stage whisper that carried perfectly through the dry air. "We do not eat there, Clara, and stop staring. If you do not learn your manners and keep your face out of the sun, you might end up like her, alone, selling scraps on the street corner. No man wants a woman who looks like a dried-out saddle. The words struck Abby with the precision of a whip. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a burning shame that had nothing to do with the sun. She lowered her head, pretending to rearrange the muffins. It was then that the shadows fell over her cart. Silas McGraw stood there, blocking the light. He was flanked by Sheriff Boone Carver. McGraw looked at Abby's setup with the expression of a man who had stepped in something foul. "Mr. McGraw," Abby said, her voice trembling slightly. "Sheriff, would you like some?" "I would like to know why this eyesore is cluttering up the street," McGraw interrupted. He reached out with a gloved hand, dipped a finger into the nearest pot of stew, and tasted it. He grimaced, wiping his finger on a silk handkerchief, which he then dropped into the dust. "Slop," McGraw pronounced. "Fit only for dogs, maybe not even them." "It is good stew, sir," Abby said, a spark of defiance igniting in her chest. "The miners like it. The miners would eat their own boots if you boiled them long enough," Sheriff Carver said, stepping forward. He rested his hand on the butt of his pistol. "We are trying to civilize this town. Sloan, we have investors coming from the east. They do not want to see a spinster peddling burnt crusts next to the savages. It lowers the tone." "I have a permit," Abby argued, desperation creeping into her tone. "I paid $2 for it." "Permits can be revoked," Carver said, leaning in close. The smell of stale alcohol on his breath made Abby recoil. "Pack it up. Abby, move along. If I see this wagon here next Saturday, I will confiscate it for obstructing public order." "But I need the money," Abby whispered. "I need to pay my rent." "Then find a new profession," McGraw said coldly. "Though I cannot imagine what else you would be good for." They turned to leave, laughing, taking the air and the hope from Abby's lungs. She stood frozen, the humiliation washing over her in cold waves. She looked at her pots of stew, the food she had woken at 4 in the morning to prepare. It was all she had. It was her art, her livelihood, her identity. And they had turned it into a joke. She reached for the reins of her horse, prepared to leave, prepared to surrender. Then the silence came. It rippled outward from the edge of the market, silencing the laughter, the haggling, and the jeering. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. Rafe. 2 Moons was walking toward her wagon. He moved with a fluidity that belied his size. He had dismounted his horse and left it with his men at the edge of the plaza, walking the last 50 yards alone. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, fear etching a wide path in the dust. He wore his dust-colored coat, his Stetson pulled low, shadowing his eyes. He did not look at McGraw or the sheriff. He did not look at the trembling townspeople. He walked straight to Abby's wagon. He stopped in front of the counter. Up close, he was terrifying. He smelled of wood smoke, leather, and gunpowder. A scar ran faintly along his jawline, disappearing into his dark hair. His eyes were obsidian, unreadable and ancient. Abby's heart hammered against her ribs. She could not breathe. She waited for the insult, for the threat, for the final blow that would shatter her completely. Rafe looked at the pot McGraw had tasted. Then he looked at the other 2. He looked at the pies. Finally, he raised his eyes to Abby's face. "How much?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder in a canyon. Abby blinked. "Sir." "For all of it," Rafe said. "The stew, the bread, the pies, everything." A gasp went through the crowd. McGraw stopped in his tracks and turned around, his face reddening. Abby stammered. She tried to calculate. It would be nearly $3. Sir, there is a lot of meat." Rafe reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a leather pouch and extracted a single gold coin, a $10 eagle. He placed it on the wooden counter. The sound of the heavy gold hitting the wood echoed in the silence. "Keep the change," Rafe said. He did not wait for her to react. He turned his head slightly, addressing the air, though everyone knew who he was speaking to. "The food in this town tastes like hypocrisy," he said. "I prefer honest meat." He turned back to Abby. Bring the wagon to the dry wash north of the church. My men are hungry." He turned and walked away, his spurs chiming softly in the dust. Abby stared at the gold coin. It glinted in the sun, a blinding promise of salvation. She looked up, but Rafe was already mounting his horse. She scrambled onto the seat of her wagon, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins. She snapped them, and Buster lurched forward. She drove out of the market, head high, leaving the stunned silence of Red Mesa behind her. The dry wash was a mile out of town, a place where the red earth cracked open to reveal a bed of white stones and a trickle of persistent water. The cottonwoods here were ancient and twisted, offering deep, cool shade. Rafe's men were waiting. There were 5 of them. They did not look like the polished soldiers from the fort or the swaggering cowboys from the saloon. They looked like survivors. Their clothes were mended with sinew, their weapons were clean, and their eyes were sharp. They helped Abby unload the heavy pots with a reverence that shocked her. They did not mock her. They did not stare at her plain face or her rough hands. They stared at the food. Abby served them. She watched as they ate, tearing into the bread and savoring the stew. The young boy, Elias, closed his eyes as he ate a piece of pie, a look of pure bliss on his face. Rafe sat apart from the others, leaning against the trunk of a cottonwood tree. He held a bowl of stew in one hand, but he was watching her. Abby felt his gaze. It was heavy, but it did not feel like the weight of judgment she was used to. It felt like an assessment, a weighing of soul rather than skin. She walked over to collect his empty bowl. He did not hand it to her immediately. "People treat you like this every day?" he asked. It was not a question born of pity. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a cold curiosity. Abby froze. She looked at the creek, at the water struggling over the stones. She thought of the market, of the laughter, of the way she had been made to feel small and ugly and worthless for as long as she could remember. She took a breath and turned to look him in the eye. For the first time in her life, she did not look down. She did not apologize for her existence. "I'm not pretty, sir, but I can cook," she said the rejected woman to the most feared man in town. The words hung in the air between them. It was a confession and a challenge. It was an admission of her reality and a defiant claim of her worth. Rafe studied her. A corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile, but sharper. "Beauty does not fill a belly," he said quietly, "and it does not keep a man warm when the snow comes." He placed the bowl in her hands. Their fingers brushed. His skin was rough, calloused like hers. "My camp is 2 days' ride from here," Rafe said, "high in the Dragoon Mountains. We live rough. We eat hardtack and jerky that tastes like shoe leather. We have gold, we have guns, but we do not have a hearth." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "They spit on you down here. Abigail Sloan, they look at your face and they do not see you. Up on the mountain, we are blind to everything but loyalty and skill. I need a cook. I will pay you $10 a week. You will have your own tent. You will be safe. No man will touch you unless you invite him." Abby stared at him. $10 a week. It was a fortune. It was independence, but it was also madness. He was asking her to leave civilization, to live with outlaws, to become a pariah. "You are asking me to run away with the Two Moons gang," she whispered. "I am asking you if you want to be a servant to people who hate you, or a queen to men who will starve without you." Rafe replied, "Think about it. We ride at dawn." Abby drove the empty wagon back into Red Mesa in a daze. The sun was high now, the heat oppressive. The gold coin burned a hole in her pocket. She arrived at the livery stable to find her belongings scattered in the dirt street. Her trunk was overturned, her mother's quilt lying in the dust. Her spare apron was trampled. Mrs. Higgins stood on the boardwalk, arms crossed, a triumphant sneer on her face. A small crowd had gathered the stable boy, a few women from the laundry, the idlers from the saloon. "I told you, Abigail." "Mrs." Higgins screeched. 2 days, I changed my mind. Mr. Henderson from the mine offered me $6 for the room, and he paid in advance. I want you out, now!" Abby climbed down from the wagon, her legs shaking. She rushed to gather her things, her heart breaking as she saw the mud on her mother's quilt. "But I have the money," Abby cried, reaching for the gold coin. "I have it, look." She held up the eagle. "Misses." Higgins laughed. It was a cruel, cackling sound. "And where did a gutter rat like you get a gold eagle? You stole it, or worse." She looked at the crowd. She probably lifted it from the collection plate, or opened her legs for a drunkard, though Lord knows who would pay that price. The crowd roared with laughter. "Thief!" someone shouted. "Whore!" shouted another, though the word seemed absurd applied to Abby. "You take your blood money and get out." Misses. Higgins spat. "I run a respectable house. I will not have the sheriff coming here asking about stolen gold." Abby stood amidst the wreckage of her life. She looked at the faces around her. These were the people she had grown up with, the people she had fed for pennies, the people she had tried so hard to please, to be invisible for, to serve. They did not see her. They saw a target. They saw a punching bag for their own miseries. "She should go with the Indians," the stable hand yelled, throwing a clod of dirt that struck Abby's shoulder. "Go be a squaw. It is all you are fit for." Abby clutched the quilt to her chest. The dirt on her shoulder felt like a brand. She looked at the saloon, where Sheriff Carver was watching from the porch, a toothpick in his mouth, doing nothing to stop the mob. She realized then that Rafe Two Moons was right. There was nothing for her here. No home, no future, only the slow, grinding death of her spirit. She threw the rest of her things into the back of the wagon. She did not cry. The tears had dried up, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. That night, Abby sat in the small, stifling room that was no longer hers, lit by a single flickering candle. The gold coin sat on the table next to her mother's Bible. She thought of the mountains. She thought of the danger. She thought of the stories of Rafe Two Moons, the killer, the savage. Then she thought of his eyes. "Do people treat you like this every day?" He had asked because he knew. He knew what it was to be looked at with hatred. He knew what it was to be judged before he even spoke. He had looked at her and offered her a job, a trade, labor for respect. Abby stood up. She packed the candle. She packed the Bible. She tied her bonnet tight. She walked out to the stable, hitched up Buster, and climbed onto the seat. The town was asleep, silent and dark. She steered the wagon not toward the main road, but toward the northern trail, toward the jagged silhouette of the Dragoon Mountains that cut into the star-filled sky. She was Abigail Sloane. She was plain, she was poor, but she could cook, and she was done begging for crumbs from a table where she was not welcome. She drove into the dark, toward the fire of the most feared man in town. The journey up into the Dragoon Mountains was a punishment and a revelation. For 2 days, Abigail Sloane drove her creaking wagon over terrain that God had seemingly crumpled in a fit of rage, and then baked until it was hard as iron. They left the flat, dusty scrubland of Red Mesa behind, ascending into a world of towering red rocks that jutted into a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Rafe. 2 Moons rode ahead, silent and implacable. He did not turn back to check on her. It was a test. Abby realized. He was waiting to see if her old horse would die, if her wagon wheels would shatter, or if she would simply turn around and flee back to the safety of her misery. But Abby did not turn back. She gripped the leather reins until her palms blistered. She coaxed Buster up steep inclines where the gravel slipped dangerously under his hooves. She watched the landscape change from gray sagebrush to green pinon pine and juniper. Hawks circled in the updrafts, screaming their lonely cries. And once, she saw a herd of antelope flowing like water across a distant ridge. It was terrifying. It was exhausting. And for the first time in her 26 years, it felt like she was actually breathing. The air here was thin and sharp, smelling of pine resin and freedom. On the afternoon of the second day, they crested a ridge and looked down into a hidden box canyon. It was a natural fortress, protected on 3 sides by sheer cliff walls. A stream cut through the center, lined with cottonwoods turning gold in the autumn chill. "Home," Rafe said. He had dropped back to ride beside her wagon, his voice startling her after hours of silence. "It is well hidden," Abby managed to say, her throat dry. "It has to be," Rafe replied. They descended into the camp. It was not a town, but it was not merely a campsite either. There were teepees made of buffalo hide standing alongside rough-hewn log cabins. There was a large communal fire pit, a rope corral holding 30 horses, and the smell of wood smoke and curing leather. As they rode in, the activity in the camp ceased. People emerged from the structures. It was the same mix she had seen in Rafe's riding party, but multiplied. There were Mexican vaqueros repairing saddles, Cheyenne women scraping hides, white men cleaning rifles, and children of every shade running between them. They all stared at Abby. The silence was heavy, loaded with suspicion. In Red Mesa, the stares had been filled with mockery. Here, they were filled with calculations. Is she a threat? Is she a spy? Is she a burden? Rafe dismounted and handed his reins to the young boy. "Elias." He walked over to Abby's wagon and offered a hand to help her down. Abby hesitated, then took it. His grip was firm, his palm warm and rough. He swung her down to the dusty ground. "This is Abigail Sloan," Rafe announced to the camp. His voice carried without shouting. "She is the new cook." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. A short, bow-legged cowboy with a face like a dried walnut spat on the ground. This was Pike. "A cook," Pike grumbled, stepping forward. "She looks like she would break if she lifted a skillet. And a town woman, she will poison us with soap and civilization." Rafe looked at Pike. He did not speak. He just looked. Pike shifted his weight and looked away. "Set up her tent near the stream," Rafe ordered. "Show her the stores. Supper is at sundown." He turned to Abby. "You have 3 hours. Impress them, or you will be sleeping with the horses." The kitchen was an open-air arrangement of stones around a fire pit, a few heavy cast-iron spiders, and a table made of split logs. The pantry was a small dugout cellar that contained sacks of flour, dried beans, coffee, and several haunches of venison that hung from hooks, draped in cheesecloth. Abby tied her apron tight. She assessed her enemies a pile of dry mesquite wood, a side of deer meat that was tough and lean, and a sack of cornmeal. She went to work. She did not cook like a frantic woman trying to save her life. She cooked like an artist finding her medium. She butchered the venison with quick, sure strokes, separating the sinew from the muscle. She saved the bones. "What are you doing with the trash?" Pike asked, hovering nearby, watching her with hawk-like eyes. "Flavor," Abby said shortly. She roasted the bones in the fire until they were brown, then threw them into the largest pot with water to make a broth. She soaked the beans, not just in water, but with a pinch of wood ash she collected from the cold side of the fire, a trick her mother had learned from a Cherokee neighbor to soften the skins. She made dough for cornbread, mixing in chopped wild onions and bits of rendered fat she had trimmed from the meat. The sun began to dip behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in violent streaks of violet and blood orange. The camp settled into its evening rhythm. The men came in from patrol. The women finished their chores. And then, the smell hit them. It started as a whisper, the scent of roasting meat and bubbling broth. Then it grew, rich and complex, the smell of savory herbs and baking corn. It was a smell that bypassed the brain and went straight to the stomach, awakening a hunger that hardtack and jerky could never satisfy. By the time Abby banged the metal spoon against the rim of the pot, a line had formed. She stood behind the log table, her face flushed from the heat, strands of hair escaping her bonnet. She felt their eyes on her, waiting for a mistake. Rafe was first in line. He held out a tin plate. Abby ladled a generous portion of the stew thick, dark, and steaming, and placed a square of golden cornbread beside it. Rafe took the plate. He did not say thank you. He walked to a flat rock near the fire and sat down. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath. Even the horses in the corral were quiet. Rafe took a spoonful of the stew. He chewed slowly. His expression remained unreadable. He swallowed. Then he took a bite of the cornbread. He looked up at Abby across the firelight. For a moment, the world narrowed down to just the two of them. He gave a single, sharp nod. It was a seal of approval. It was a decree. The tension in the line broke instantly. The men stepped forward, thrusting their plates out. "Hit me, Cookie!" Pike grunted. Abby filled his plate. Pike took a bite, and his walnut face unwrinkled in sheer surprise. "Well, I will be damned," Pike mumbled, his mouth full. "This is edible. Better than edible. It tastes like Sunday." "It tastes like actual food," Elias said, scraping his plate clean and looking hopefully for seconds. Abby served them all, her hands moving rhythmically. For the first time in days, the knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen. They were not looking at her plain face. They were not looking at her old dress. They were looking at the food she had prepared. They were respecting the skill of her hands. Later that night, as she was scrubbing the pots with sand from the creek, she felt a presence behind her. It was an older woman, her hair gray and braided with leather strips. She wore a dress of soft buckskin and a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. This was Asha, Rafe's aunt. Asha did not smile. Her eyes were sharp, dark, and full of a history that Abby could not begin to understand. She held a bundle of dried leaves in her hand. "You use too much sage," Asha said. Her voice was like dry leaves rustling. "It masks the meat." Abby stiffened, wiping her hands on her apron. "I thought it needed—" "For deer, yes," Asha interrupted. "For elk, no. Elk need juniper." She held out the bundle. "This is mountain sage, stronger than the dust you brought from the valley. Use half as much." Abby took the herbs. It was an offering, and a correction. "Thank you," Abby said. She hesitated, then gestured to the hanging meat. "The venison. It dries out too fast in this wind. If we rub it with salt and brown sugar before we smoke it, it will keep the juice." Asha raised an eyebrow. "Sugar is expensive. I can make molasses from the pods of the mesquite beans," Abby countered. "My father showed me." Asha studied her for a long moment. The suspicion did not vanish, but it shifted, making room for curiosity. "Show me tomorrow," Asha said. "If it ruins the meat, you will eat it all yourself." She turned and walked away into the darkness. Abby watched her go, realizing she had just negotiated her first treaty. The days turned into a week, then two. Abby fell into a rhythm that was grueling but satisfying. She woke before the sun to start the fire. She cooked breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 30 men. She hauled water. She learned to dodge the kick of a mule and the sharp tongue of Pike. She was an anomaly. The white men in the camp were wary of her because she was a woman alone. The Cheyenne were wary because she was white. She lived in the space between, just as she had in town. But the quality of the isolation was different here. In town, she was invisible because she was unwanted. Here, she was watched because she was necessary. One evening, as the camp settled down, Abby sat on a log near the dying fire, mending a tear in her skirt. She felt a shadow fall over her. Rafe stood there. He held 2 tin cups of coffee. He extended one to her. Abby took it, her fingers brushing his. The shock of contact was becoming familiar, a small jolt of electricity that she tried to ignore. "The men are getting fat," Rafe said, sitting down on the log, leaving a respectful distance between them. Pike had to loosen his belt. "He eats 3 portions, Abby said with a small smile. "He complains the whole time, but he eats." "He likes you," Rafe said. "That is why he complains." He took a sip of the black coffee. The firelight danced on the sharp angles of his face, softening the hardness of his eyes. "You fit in here, Abigail," Rafe said quietly. Abby looked down at her cup. "Do I? They call me Indian lover down in the valley. Up here, I am the white woman who burns the sage wrong. You are the woman who fills their bellies and does not flinch when they curse," Rafe said. "That makes you one of us. We are all strays here, broken things that did not fit anywhere else." "I am not broken," Abby said, lifting her chin. I was just discarded. Rafe turned to look at her. His gaze was intense, stripping away her defenses. One man's trash is another man's treasure, he said. The words were soft, almost intimate. Abby felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She wanted to lean toward him. She wanted to bridge the distance on the log. But the moment was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats. A rider galloped into the camp, his horse lathered and blowing hard. It was one of the scouts Rafe had posted near the southern pass. Rafe stood up instantly, the softness vanishing from his face. He was the leader again, cold and alert. "What is it?" Rafe demanded. The scout swung down, gasping for air. "Soldiers, a whole survey team, and McGraw." The name hung in the air like smoke. "Where?" "They are marking the line," the scout said. "Right through the lower valley, through the winter grazing grounds." Asha emerged from her tent, her face grim. "That is treaty land. McGraw does not care about treaties," Rafe said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "He has bought the army. If they run the tracks through there, they will cut off our water. They will starve us out." "What do we do?" Pike asked, his hand going to his gun. "We stop them," Rafe said. "But not tonight. Tonight, we will watch." He turned to Abby. His face was hard, the intimacy of a moment ago completely gone. "You should not be here. Abigail." Abby stood up, clutching her coffee cup. "I have nowhere else to go." "This is going to get ugly," Rafe warned. "McGraw will bring the cavalry. There will be shooting. There will be blood. If they catch you here, with us, they will hang you as an accomplice." "Let them try," Abby said. Her voice surprised her. It was steady. It was fierce. Rafe looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes that matched the one in the pit. "I can take you to the mission in San Cristobal," Rafe offered. "The nuns will take you in." "I am not a nun," Abby said. "And I am not a coward. I cook for this camp, Rafe 2 moons, and I am not leaving just because the kitchen is getting hot." Rafe stared at her for a long heartbeat. Then, a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. It was not a pleasant smile. It was a wolf's smile. "Suit yourself. Cook," he said. "But keep your head down. I would hate to lose the only person who knows how to make decent cornbread." He turned and walked toward the scout, barking orders. Abby watched him go. She felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach, but beneath it burned a new, fierce pride. She was terrified. Yes, but for the first time in her life, she had chosen her side. And she would stand by it, even if the whole world came crashing down around them. She threw the dregs of her coffee into the fire. The flames hissed and leaped up, bright and defiant against the encroaching dark. The sun had dipped below the jagged rim of the canyon, leaving the sky bruised in shades of violet and deep indigo. The air in the high country cooled rapidly, biting at exposed skin with the teeth of the coming autumn. Inside the small log cabin that served as the command center for Rafe 2 moons, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn walls. Rafe sat on the edge of a narrow cot, his shirt stripped off and tossed onto a chair. His skin, bronzed and scarred from a life that had offered him no quarter, gleamed with a sheen of sweat. A fresh, angry gash ran across his left shoulder, the result of a bushwhack patrol near the southern pass. It was not a bullet wound the bullet had grazed him, but the fall from his horse into the scree had torn the flesh deep. Abby stood between his knees, a basin of warm water and a clean cloth in her hands. The scent in the room was intimate pine resin, wood smoke, the metallic tang of blood, and the earthy smell of the man himself. "Hold still," Abby murmured, dipping the cloth into the water. "You are flinching like a greenhorn." "I am not flinching," Rafe grunted, though his muscles bunched under her touch. "Ideally, I prefer not to be scrubbed with sandpaper." "It is linen," Abby corrected him softly. She pressed the cloth to the wound, cleaning away the dried blood with efficient, gentle strokes. She was close enough to feel the heat radiating from his chest. She tried to keep her eyes on the wound, on the task at hand, but her gaze betrayed her. It traced the heavy line of his collarbone, the dark tattoo of a hawk on his pectoral muscle, the way his breath hitched slightly when the alcohol stung the raw skin. In the weeks she had been at the camp, they had circled each other like two wary predators, or perhaps like two lonely planets caught in the same gravity. There was respect. Yes, there was gratitude for the food. But this quiet proximity was new. Rafe looked up. His eyes, usually so guarded, were wide open, watching her face in the firelight. "You have a light hand," he said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated in the small space between them. "My father was often injured," Abby said, focusing intently on applying the salve Asha had given her. "A homesteader learns to stitch and bind, or they do not last the winter." She finished the dressing and tied the bandage off. As she pulled back, Rafe caught her wrist. His grip was not forceful, but it was absolute. He did not pull her closer, nor did he push her away. He simply held her there, tethered to him. "Why do you hide your face?" Rafe asked. Abby blinked, startled. She instinctively tried to turn her head, to angle her chin down as she had done for a decade in Red Mesa. "I do not hide." "You do," Rafe insisted softly. He released her wrist and reached up, his rough thumb grazing her cheekbone, tilting her face toward the firelight. "You walk with your head down. You wear that bonnet like a shield, even here." "It is a habit," Abby whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "When you are plain, it is better not to force people to look at you." Rafe frowned, a deep crease appearing between his brows. His thumb moved to her lip, tracing the bottom edge. "Plain." He repeated the word as if it were a foreign insult. "The men in that town are blind. They look at paint and powder and think that is beauty. They are blind to the fire." He looked at her with such intensity that Abby felt her knees weaken. "People are blind if they do not see you are beautiful standing by that fire." "Abigail," he said, "you look like endurance. You look like the earth." Abby felt a flush rise from her neck to her hairline, hotter than the stove she slaved over. Tears pricked her eyes not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming shock of being seen. "I am just the cook. Rafe," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "I am the rejected woman, the one nobody wanted." Rafe's hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the loose strands of her hair. "And I am the monster," he replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "The half-breed killer. But you are here, in my cabin, and I noticed you ate every bite of the stew I caught. And you are still standing here." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I am still eating your food. Abby, I have not sent the plate back yet." It was a joke, a callback to their first meeting, but it carried the weight of a vow. He was telling her he wanted her, not a fantasy of her, but her. Abby let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "It needs more salt," she whispered, playing along. Rafe chuckled, a low, warm sound that seemed to heal something inside her chest. He leaned his forehead against hers. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire popping in the grate, the wind howling outside, two outcasts finding a shelter in the simple act of breathing the same air. He did not kiss her. He did not move his hands to her waist. The intimacy was in the restraint, in the promise of what could be, if they survived the storm that was coming. The storm came 3 days later, but it was not the political storm they feared. It was the land itself reminding them of its power. It began with a strange, sickly yellow tinge to the sky at noon. The wind died down to an eerie silence, and the birds stopped singing. Then, the horizon simply disappeared, swallowed by a wall of rolling, churning brown dust that stretched from the earth to the heavens. "Sandstorm," Pike bellowed from the perimeter. "Secure the horses, tie down the hides." The camp erupted into chaos. The wall of dust hit them with the force of a physical blow. The day turned instantly to a suffocating, gritty twilight. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the canvas of the tents and ripping shingles from the cabin roofs. Abby did not retreat to the safety of the cabin. She wrapped a scarf around her face and ran to the cooking pit, The fire was dangerous in this wind. Sparks could ignite the dry brush and burn the entire camp down. "Water!" she screamed over the gale. Grabbing a bucket, she doused the fire, the steam hissing violently as it mixed with the dust. Then she ran to the supply tent. The flaps had come loose, and the precious sacks of flour were threatened. If the flour got wet or filled with sand, they would starve. She found Asha there, struggling to hold down a heavy canvas tarp over the crates. The older woman was small, and the wind was lifting her off her feet. Abby threw her weight onto the tarp, grabbing Asha's arm. "I have got it." Together, they lashed the ropes to the stakes, their hands bleeding from the friction. The sand scoured their skin, stinging like 1,000 needles. Through the swirling brown mist, Abby saw a teepee collapse, trapping a young mother and her child inside. Without thinking, she let go of the tarp and sprinted across the clearing. She grabbed a knife from her belt, a butcher's knife she kept sharp, and slashed the heavy buffalo hide, creating an exit. She pulled the woman and the crying baby out, shielding them with her own body as they stumbled toward the main cabin. When the wind finally died down hours later, the camp was buried in a foot of red drift. Everything was coated in grit. But they were alive. Rafe walked through the camp, checking the damage. He found Abby near the water trough, washing the dust from the baby's eyes. Her own face was caked in mud, her dress torn at the hem, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked up at him and nodded, a simple, weary gesture. Rafe looked at his men. They were looking at her too. There was no suspicion in their eyes anymore. She had not hidden. She had not cried. She had stood in the wind and held the line. She was no longer just the cook. She was of the tribe. But the peace of the mountains was fragile. 2 days after the sandstorm, while the men were still digging out the corral, the sentries fired 2 warning shots. A column of riders was winding its way up the canyon trail. At the head rode Sheriff Boone Carver, the tin star on his chest catching the sun. Behind him were 20 men deputies and a detachment of cavalry soldiers in blue uniforms. Rafe ordered his men to stand down but keep their weapons ready. He walked out to meet them at the edge of the camp. Abby stood by the cooking fire, her hand gripping a heavy iron ladle like a weapon. Sheriff Boone pulled his horse up, looking around the camp with a sneer of disgust. "2 moons," Boone called out. "You are living high for a savage. This is treaty land." "Sheriff," Rafe said, his voice cold and level, "you have no jurisdiction here." "I have jurisdiction wherever the law is broken," Boone retorted. "We are investigating a robbery. The Pacific Union payroll train was hit yesterday. 3 guards died. Witnesses say it was a band of Indians. My men have been here, digging out from the storm," Rafe said. "We have not left the canyon. That is for a judge to decide," Boone said. His eyes scanned the camp and landed on Abby. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Well, Boone drawled. "If it isn't Abigail Sloan, the town has been worried sick about you. Girl, we thought you had been snatched." He rode closer, his horse kicking up dust near the food stores. "But you do not look snatched," Boone said, his voice dripping with insinuation. "You look like you have made yourself right at home, cooking for them or warming their blankets." The soldiers laughed. Abby felt the blood drain from her face, but she stood her ground. "I am working. Sheriff," Abby said clearly. "Mister, 2 moons pays me a wage, which is more than I can say for the honest businessmen of Red Mesa." Boone's smile vanished. "You watch your tongue. You are coming back with us. Sloan, we need a statement." "She stays," Rafe said, stepping forward. His hand hovered over his Colt. Behind him, Pike and the others raised their rifles. The soldiers clicked the hammers of their carbines. The air crackled with tension. One wrong move, one twitch, and the canyon would turn into a slaughterhouse. "If you keep a white woman here against the law's request," Boone shouted, raising his voice for the soldiers to hear, "then you are admitting to kidnapping. We will burn this camp to the ground." Asha stepped up beside Rafe. She placed a hand on his arm, whispering urgently in Cheyenne, "Do not give them the excuse. Nephew, not today. They want a massacre." Abby saw the trap. If she stayed, Boone would start a war, Rafe would fight, and he would die. Elias would die. She dropped the ladle. "I will go," Abby said. Rafe spun around. "No, I will go and give my statement," Abby said, walking toward the sheriff. She looked Rafe in the eye, trying to communicate everything she could not say. "I am saving you. I have nothing to hide. I will tell them the truth." "Smart girl," Boone sneered. "Mount up. Let us get this trash back to where it belongs." The ride back to Red Mesa was a descent into hell. Boone made her ride double behind a deputy who smelled of sweat and leered at her. They rode fast, giving her no comfort. When they entered the town, it was midday. The news had spread. People came out of the shops and the saloon to watch. This was not like the day she left. This was worse. Abby walked her horse down the main street, her clothes dusty, her hair windblown. The townspeople pointed. "There she is," a woman hissed. "The squaw lover. Look at her," a man shouted. "She has gone native. Probably sleeps with the whole tribe." "Shameful, Mrs." Sterling declared from the boardwalk, shielding her daughter's eyes. "A camp whore. She can never show her face in church again." The words were like stones, pelting her from all sides. Abby kept her chin high, staring straight ahead at the sheriff's office. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She knew who she was. She knew the honor of the men on the mountain was worth more than the false piety of this entire town. Boone shoved her into the interrogation room. It was a small cell with a single table and a barred window. He slammed the door and sat opposite her, lighting a cigar. "Now, Abigail," Boone said, his voice falsely sweet. "Let us make this easy. We know 2 moons hit that train. McGraw has proof. We just need a witness to place him away from the camp." "He was at the camp," Abby said. "We were in a sandstorm. No one could ride in that." "Memories can be tricky," Boone said, blowing smoke in her face. "Here's the deal. You sign a paper saying Rafe was gone for 6 hours yesterday. You say he came back with gold. You do that, and we forget you ever went up there. You can go to Santa Fe, start over. McGraw will even give you $100. Abby looked at him with utter contempt. "You want me to lie so you can hang an innocent man?" "Innocent," Boone laughed. "He is a savage. Abby, he is an animal. You are a white woman. You should be on our side." "I am on the side of the people who fed me when you starved me," Abby said, her voice rising. "I am on the side of the man who treated me with respect while you treated me like cattle." Boone's face darkened. He stood up and leaned over the table. "You protect him. You hang with him. I would rather hang with him than dine with you." Abby spat. "I only cook for them. Sheriff, you are the one who is thirsty for blood. You and McGraw." The slap came so fast she didn't see it. Boone's backhand caught her across the cheekbone, knocking her out of the chair. Her head hit the floor with a dull thud. "Think about it in the dark. You bitch!" Boone snarled. He walked out, slamming the heavy iron door and turning the key. Abby lay on the cold floor, tasting copper in her mouth. Her cheek throbbed. She curled into a ball, but she did not weep. The strike had clarified everything. There was no going back. Red Mesa was not her home. It was a prison. Hours passed. Night fell, bringing a chill to the cell. Abby heard a scratching sound at the small, high window that faced the alley. "Miss Abby." A whisper. She scrambled up, dragging a stool over. "Who is it?" "It is old Tom," the voice rasped. Tom was the dishwasher at the saloon, a crippled old man to whom Abby had often given extra soup. "Tom, I heard what Boone did," Tom whispered. "It isn't right. Hitting a woman, framing a man. The window bars are loose. Miss Abby, I loosened the mortar with a chisel. Push!" Abby pushed. The iron bars, set in crumbling adobe, gave way with a groan. She squeezed through the narrow opening, scraping her shoulders, and tumbled into the dust of the alley. Old Tom was there, holding the reins of a horse. It was Buster. "I found him in the corral," Tom said, handing her the reins. "Ride, Miss Abby, Ride fast. Do not look back." "Thank you, Tom," Abby whispered, gripping his gnarled hand. "I will never forget this." She mounted the old horse. He was tired, but he seemed to sense her urgency. She kept to the shadows, skirting the edge of town, avoiding the lanterns of the saloon. As she hit the open trail, the moon broke through the clouds. She urged Buster into a gallop, leaving the lights of Red Mesa behind her forever. She reached the foothills of the Dragoons just before dawn. She was freezing. Her cheek was swollen purple, and her body ached from the ride. She did not have to ride all the way to the canyon. A figure was waiting for her at the trailhead, sitting on a large bay stallion. Rafe. He had defied Asha. He had come down to get her, or to die trying. When he saw her emerge from the gloom, he spurred his horse forward. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and ran to her. Abby slid down from Buster, her legs giving way. Rafe caught her. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck. He was shaking. The most feared man in town was shaking. "I thought—" His voice broke. "I thought I had lost you." He pulled back to look at her. In the gray light of dawn, he saw the bruise on her face. His eyes went black, a terrifying, murderous void. "Boone," he whispered. It was not a name. It was a death sentence. "It does not matter," Abby said, grabbing the lapels of his coat. "I am here. I got away. I did not tell them anything." Rafe led her to a small fire he had built in the shelter of a rock overhang. He wrapped a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders and poured a cup of coffee from a tin pot. "Here," he said gently. "Drink." Abby sipped the bitter, hot liquid. It tasted like life. "He offered me freedom," Abby said, staring into the fire. "He offered me money to say you robbed the train. I told him you were a better man than he would ever be." Rafe sat beside her, close, his thigh pressing against hers. He took her hand in his. His fingers were calloused, scarred, dangerous, and incredibly gentle. "I spent my whole life looking for a place to stand," Rafe said, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I was just a weapon, a thing to be used or feared. I thought I belonged nowhere." He squeezed her hand. "But when I saw them take you, when I saw you ride away to save my people," he looked at her, his eyes shining with a fierce light. "I realized I do have a place. My place is wherever you're standing. Abigail." Abby turned to him. The pain in her cheek faded. The shame of the town faded. "Then take me home." "Rafe," she whispered. "Take me back to the fire." He did not kiss her then. It was too profound for that. He simply pulled her against his chest, wrapping his strong arms around her, shielding her from the wind and the world. They sat there as the sun rose over the red rocks. Two outcasts who had forged a new world in the space between a heartbeat and a breath. "We will make them pay," Rafe whispered into her hair. "No," Abby said softly, closing her eyes. "We will make them see." The peace of the canyon was shattered not by thunder, but by the orchestrated chaos of Silas McGraw's ambition. It began on a Tuesday, under a sky so clear it felt like a judgment. A Pacific Union payroll train, steaming along the newly laid tracks 5 miles east of the reservation line, was derailed. Explosives tore through the iron rails, and a band of men descended upon the wreckage. They wore buckskins and feathers, their faces painted with the red clay of the earth, and they whooped with the distinct war cries of the Cheyenne. They slaughtered the guards with brutal efficiency, leaving behind not just corpses, but deliberately placed evidence: a knife with a beaded handle, a moccasin with a distinctive stitching pattern, and a hawk feather dipped in blood. It was theater, macabre and bloody, performed for an audience of politicians and investors. By Wednesday morning, the hammer fell on the Two Moons camp. Abby was kneading dough near the fire when the world exploded. One moment, the air smelled of yeast and pine. The next, it smelled of sulfur. A volley of rifle fire tore through the upper ridge, pinning down Rafe's sentries before the men in the camp could reach their weapons. The canyon floor was swarming with blue uniforms. Sheriff Boone Carver rode in at the head of the column, flanked by 50 cavalrymen. This was not a skirmish. It was an invasion. "Down!" Rafe roared, shoving Abby behind the thick trunk of an oak tree. "Do not shoot! Hold your fire!" He knew what Boone wanted. He wanted a massacre. He wanted the Two Moons gang to fight back so he could justify slaughtering every man, woman, and child in the valley. Rafe walked out into the open, his hands raised, his chest heaving. "Take me," Rafe shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Leave the others. I am the one you want." Boone dismounted, his face twisted in a triumphant grin. He walked up to Rafe and, without a word, smashed the butt of his rifle into Rafe's stomach. Rafe doubled over, gasping, and 2 soldiers seized his arms, twisting them violently behind his back. "Rafe 2 Moons," Boone announced, loud enough for the terrified camp to hear. "You are under arrest for the robbery of the Pacific Union train and the murder of 3 federal employees." "It is a lie," Pike shouted, stepping forward, his hand on his revolver. "Stand down." "Pike," Rafe gasped, blood trickling from his mouth. "Stand down. That is an order." The soldiers swarmed Rafe, binding his wrists with a rough hemp rope, pulling it so tight Abby could see the skin turn white. They kicked his legs out from under him, forcing him to his knees in the dust. Abby watched, her heart shattering. She saw Elias, the young orphan, standing by the corral, tears streaming down his face, clutching a stirrup leather. She saw the fear in the eyes of the women. She could not stop the army. She could not shoot the sheriff, but she could not stand idle. She ran forward. "Get back, woman!" a soldier shouted, aiming his carbine at her. Abby ignored him. She rushed to where Rafe knelt. She did not look at Boone. She looked only at Rafe. His eye was already swollen shut, and there was blood on his teeth. "Rafe," she whispered. She grabbed his bound hands. In her palm, she held a small leather pouch given to her by Asha weeks ago, a mixture of dried yarrow and willow bark, meant to dull pain and stop bleeding. She shoved it into his clenched fist. "Hold on," she whispered fiercely. "Do not let them break you." Rafe looked up at her, even beaten and bound. His eyes were fierce. "Stay here. Abigail, do not follow." Boone grabbed Abby by the shoulder and threw her back into the dirt. "Get this trash out of my sight," Boone spat. He hauled Rafe to his feet and tied the end of his rope to his saddle pommel. "We are taking him to Red Mesa. We will have a trial at noon tomorrow." And hanging at 1 o'clock, the column rode out, dragging Rafe behind them like a trophy. The dust settled over the camp, heavy and suffocating. The despair in the camp was absolute. But for Abby, despair was a luxury she could not afford. She found Asha in the medicine tent. The older woman was chanting a low, mournful prayer, but her hands were busy sharpening a skinning knife. "Prayers will not cut ropes. Asha," Abby said, her voice trembling but hard. Asha looked up. "And what will a white cook do against the United States cavalry?" "I will not fight the cavalry," Abby said. "I will fight the lie." Elias ran into the tent, breathless. "I heard the soldiers talking," the boy gasped. "They said McGraw is hosting a dinner tonight, a victory dinner for the railroad investors. They said he has the spoils in his house." Abby's eyes narrowed. "The spoils?" "The gold," Pike said, stepping into the tent. He looked ready to kill someone. "They say the gold from the train was never found. If McGraw has it." "Then he framed Rafe to cover his own theft," Abby finished. "He gets the land for the railroad, he gets rid of the tribe, and he keeps the gold." "We need to get into that house," Pike growled. "I will take the boys. We will burn it down." "No," Abby said sharply. "If you attack McGraw's house, you prove Boone right. You prove we are savages. We need proof, not ashes." She looked at her hands, the rough, red hands that had peeled 1,000 potatoes and scrubbed 1,000 floors. "They are having a dinner party," Abby said, a plan forming in the chaos of her mind. "Big dinners need cooks, they need servers, and nobody looks for help." Red Mesa was in a frenzy of bloodlust. The gallows were being erected in the town square, the hammering of nails echoing like gunshots. But up on the hill, the McGraw mansion was a beacon of light and music. Abby arrived at the service entrance of the mansion just after sunset. She was not alone. Asha was with her, dressed in the simple clothes of a washerwoman. Pike and 2 other men were hidden in the shadows of the garden, waiting for a signal. Abby wore her old, stained dress and a heavy bonnet that shadowed her face. She carried a basket of wild mushrooms she had gathered from the canyon, a peace offering, a bribe, a ticket in. The kitchen was a madhouse. The head chef, a temperamental Frenchman hired from New Orleans, was screaming at a terrifying volume. "We are short-handed," he bellowed. "The scullery maid has run off to watch the hanging preparations. Who will peel the shrimp? Who will whip the cream?" Abby stepped into the light. "I can cook, sir," she said, keeping her head down. "And I brought chanterelles from the high country." The chef looked at the mushrooms, then at her rough hands. "Wash them, then take the tray of oysters to the study." "The master is entertaining the governor." Abby moved through the kitchen with the invisibility of a ghost. She knew this rhythm. She knew the heat, the noise, the frantic energy. She blended in because she belonged to the class of people who served, not the class who ruled. She took the heavy silver tray and walked into the main house. The hallway was lined with velvet wallpaper and gas lamps. Laughter drifted from the dining room. She found the study. The door was ajar. Inside, Silas McGraw was pouring brandy for a fat man in a tailored suit. "It is a tragic necessity," McGraw was saying, his voice smooth as oil. 2 moons is a relic. The railroad is the future. Once he hangs tomorrow, the resistance will crumble." "And the gold?" the fat man asked. "A pity it was lost in the river." McGraw chuckled. "Indeed, a great pity." He turned and saw Abby standing there. For a second, her heart stopped, but he did not recognize her. To him, she was just a pair of hands holding a tray. "Put it on the desk and get out," McGraw ordered. Abby placed the tray down. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room. There, behind a half-drawn velvet curtain, stood a heavy iron safe, and sitting on top of the desk, carelessly covered by a map, was a leather-bound ledger. She bowed and backed out. She needed a distraction. Outside, the wind was picking up. The spirits of the land seemed to be listening. A sudden gust slammed against the house, rattling the windows. Abby returned to the kitchen. She grabbed a heavy sack of flour and, pretending to stumble, accidentally dropped it near the back door, just as Asha opened it from the outside to let the draft in. The wind caught the flour. A white cloud exploded into the room, blinding the cooks, coating everything in a fine mist. "Mon Dieu, the dust!" the chef screamed. "Close the door!" In the confusion, Abby slipped back into the hallway. She ran to the study. McGraw and his guest had moved to the dining room for the toast. She entered the study and locked the door. She went straight to the desk. She opened the ledger. Her hands shook, but her eyes were sharp. There, in neat columns, were the payments. Payment to Boone Carver, $500. Payment to the Vultures Mercenary Group, $1,000. Entry Pacific Union shipment. Received. She needed more. She needed the gold. She went to the safe. It was locked. But Abby Sloan had spent years watching the saloon owner. Mr. Henderson. Open his safe. She knew men like McGraw used numbers that fed their vanity. She tried his birthday. Nothing. She tried the date of the railroad founding. Nothing. Then she saw a portrait on the wall. It was not his wife or his children. It was the first locomotive he had purchased. The number painted on the side of the engine was 1869. She spun the dial. 1869. The heavy door clicked. Abby pulled it open. Inside, stacked like bricks, were bars of gold stamped with the Pacific Union seal. She grabbed one bar. It was incredibly heavy, heavier than a cast-iron skillet. She shoved the ledger into her apron waistband. As she turned to leave, her eyes fell on the tray of oysters she had brought in. A small crystal decanter of hot sauce sat next to it. For a moment, a dark, seductive thought seized her. She could poison him. She could find the rat poison in the pantry and mix it into his brandy. She could make him choke on his own greed while the town watched. It would be justice. It would be sweet, burning revenge for every time he had called her slop, for every time he had looked at her as if she were dirt. She reached for the decanter. Her hand hovered. Then she thought of Rafe. She thought of him kneeling in the dirt, surrendering to save his people. He had chosen to be better than they said he was. If she poisoned McGraw, she was just a murderer. If she exposed him, she was a revolution. She pulled her hand back. She took the gold bar and the book. She climbed out the window into the waiting arms of the night. The next day, the sun hung high and brutal over Red Mesa. The town square was packed shoulder to shoulder. Men, women, and children jostled for a view of the gallows. Rafe stood on the platform, his hands tied behind his back, a rough burlap sack over his head. The noose was already around his neck. He stood tall, silent, refusing to give them the satisfaction of hearing him beg. Sheriff Boone paced the platform, a peacock in his moment of glory. Silas McGraw sat in the front row on a velvet chair, looking solemn and aggrieved. "Citizens of Red Mesa," Boone bellowed, "we are here to see justice done. This man, this animal, slaughtered honest workers. He stole the future of this territory." "Hang him!" a woman screamed from the crowd. "String him up!" shouted the blacksmith. Boone reached for the lever that would drop the trap door. "Any last words, savage?" Boone sneered, pulling the hood off Rafe's head. Rafe blinked against the sudden light. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but his gaze was steady. He looked out at the crowd, searching. "I did not steal your gold," Rafe said, his voice raspy but clear. "And I did not kill those men." "Liar," McGraw shouted, standing up. "Get on with it." "Sheriff," Boone gripped the lever. "Wait!" The scream did not come from the crowd. It came from the street. A wagon burst into the square, the horse galloping hard, foam flying from its mouth. It was a battered, rickety food wagon, pots and pans clanging violently against the sides. It was Abby. She drove the wagon straight through the crowd, people diving out of the way, screaming. She pulled the reins hard, bringing the wagon to a screeching halt right in front of the gallows. She stood up on the driver's seat. She was wearing her stained apron. Her hair was wild, her bonnet gone. She looked like a madwoman. She looked magnificent. "Abigail Sloane," McGraw sputtered. "What is the meaning of this?" Abby reached into a sack at her feet. She pulled out the ledger and the gold bar. She held the gold bar high above her head. It caught the noon sun, flashing like a beacon. "You said my cooking was for dogs. Silas McGraw." Abby's voice rang out, the voice she had used to call customers, now amplified by rage and truth. "You said I was worth nothing, but I am worth enough to read." She threw the ledger onto the ground at the feet of the town doctor. "Read it," Abby screamed. "Read page 42, payments to the mercenaries who hit the train, payments to the sheriff to look the other way." She pointed the gold bar at McGraw. "This is the stolen gold. I found it in his safe. He stole it himself to start a war." The crowd went silent. The doctor picked up the book. He adjusted his spectacles, his hands shaking. It is true," the doctor stammered, looking up. "It is all here. McGraw's handwriting. The serial numbers match." A murmur ran through the crowd, growing into a roar. McGraw's face turned purple. "She is lying. She is the whore of the camp. She planted it." "I am the cook," Abby yelled back. "And I know the difference between rotten meat and fresh. You are rotten." "McGraw." Boone drew his pistol. "Shut her up. She is an accomplice." "No," Rafe shouted from the gallows. "Look at him. Look at the sheriff. He is afraid of a woman with a book." "Is there anyone here?" Rafe yelled, his voice booming. "Anyone I have ever helped, anyone I saved from the floods, anyone I guided through the pass, speak up or watch an innocent man die." For a second, there was silence. Then, a cowboy in the back raised his hat. "He pulled my calf out of a mudslide 2 years back. He brought my boy home when he got lost in the canyon," a woman whispered. "That gold is real," someone else shouted. "Arrest her!" McGraw screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Abby. "Shoot her!" Boone raised his gun, aiming directly at Abby's chest. Abby did not flinch. She stood tall on her wagon, the gold bar in her hand, staring down the barrel. Bang! The shot echoed through the square. But Abby did not fall. Sheriff Boone cried out, his pistol flying from his hand as a bullet shattered his wrist. He fell to his knees, clutching his bloody arm. The crowd turned. Walking out of the saloon, calm as a Sunday morning, was a man in a long dust coat with a silver badge on his chest. It was the federal marshal. Asha had sent the telegram 3 days ago, but he had waited, watching, listening. He walked into the center of the square, smoke curling from his rifle. "I will take that ledger." "Doctor," the marshal said. He looked at McGraw. "Silas McGraw, you are under arrest for grand larceny, conspiracy, and fraud against the United States government." "You cannot do this!" McGraw shrieked. "I own this town. You own a jail cell in Santa Fe," the marshal replied. "Cut the prisoner down." Pike and the other boys from the camp, who had infiltrated the crowd, rushed the gallows. They cut Rafe's ropes. Rafe stumbled, his legs numb. He rubbed his wrists. Then, with a speed that defied his injuries, he snatched a pistol from Pike's holster. He leapt off the platform and strode toward McGraw. The crowd parted. McGraw fell back into his chair, whimpering. "No, no, please." Rafe cocked the hammer. He pressed the cold steel against McGraw's forehead. The silence was absolute. The wind held its breath. Abby stood on her wagon, watching. She wanted him to do it. Every fiber of her being wanted to see McGraw bleed. "Rafe," she whispered. She did not shout. She just spoke his name. Rafe froze. His finger was white on the trigger. He looked at McGraw, the sweating, pathetic man who had tried to destroy his people. He looked at the bloodlust in the eyes of the crowd. Then he looked at Abby. She was standing in the sun, holding the gold, looking not at the monster, but at the man. If he pulled the trigger, he confirmed every lie they told about him. If he pulled the trigger, he was the savage. Rafe took a deep breath. He slowly lowered the hammer. He pistol-whipped McGraw across the face. A single, brutal blow that knocked the tycoon unconscious. "He is not worth the bullet," Rafe said, his voice cold and controlled. He turned his back on the fallen man and looked up at Abby. "Nice wagon," he said. Abby dropped the gold bar. Her knees gave way, and she sat down hard on the seat, laughing and crying at the same time. "I told you," she choked out. "I can cook." Boone, clutching his shattered wrist, tried to scramble for his dropped gun with his left hand. "You half-breed filth!" Boone screamed. The marshal did not hesitate. He fired from the hip. 3 other men in the crowd, the blacksmith, a rancher, and Pike fired at the same instant. Boone jerked backward as if kicked by a mule, hitting the dust dead before he touched the ground. The gunfire faded. The smoke drifted on the wind. Rafe walked to the wagon. He reached up and pulled Abby down into his arms. He held her there in the middle of the town square, in front of the marshal, the investors, and the people who had scorned her. He buried his face in her hair, smelling the flour and the horse sweat and the sweet, sharp scent of victory. "You are the craziest woman I have ever met," Rafe whispered against her neck. "And you," Abby replied, holding him tight enough to crack a rib, "are the worst outlaw in the history of the West." The marshal stepped forward, tipping his hat. "I suggest you two clear the square. I have a lot of paperwork to do." Rafe looked at the marshal, then at the stunned townspeople. He took Abby's hand. "Let us go home," he said. And for the first time, when he said home, he didn't mean the canyon. He meant her. The smoke from the marshal's rifle had barely drifted away when the silence fell over Red Mesa. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that follows a thunderclap, leaving the ears ringing and the heart stuttering. Sheriff Boone Carver lay in the dust, his tin star twisted and bloodied, staring up at the sun with eyes that would never blink again. Silas McGraw, the architect of their misery, was being hauled to his feet by 2 deputies who suddenly remembered their duty to the law rather than to the man who paid their gambling debts. The townspeople stood frozen. The mob mentality that had fueled them only moments ago had evaporated, leaving behind the cold, sour taste of shame. They looked from the gallows where an innocent man had stood with a noose around his neck to the woman on the wagon who had saved him. Abby stood on the seat of her battered wagon, her chest heaving. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the square was draining away, leaving her limbs trembling and her head spinning. She felt a sharp, stinging pain in her shoulder where she had struck the side of the wagon box during her frantic halt. A shard of glass from a broken jar lay embedded in her forearm, weeping red onto her sleeve. She swayed, the world tilted on its axis. Rafe was there before she could fall. He moved through the crowd not like a prisoner who had just escaped death, but like a storm front. He reached the wagon and pulled her down into his arms, his grip iron-hard yet terrified. "I have got you," he rasped, his voice rough from the dry air and the shouting. "I have got you, Abigail." Abby leaned against him, the scent of him sweat, leather, and the faint metallic tang of the chains that had bound him grounding her. She buried her face in his chest, hiding from the hundreds of eyes watching them. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It is over," Rafe promised. He turned to face the town. The federal marshal was shouting orders, organizing the transport of the prisoner and the removal of the body. But Rafe ignored him. He looked at the faces of the people of Red Mesa. He looked at the blacksmith who had called for a rope. He looked at Mrs. Sterling, who was clutching her pearls, her face the color of ash. He looked at the men who had jeered at Abby in the market. They could not meet his gaze. One by one, they looked down at their boots, at the dust, at anything but the man they had wronged and the woman they had scorned. "Mr. 2 Moons," the doctor said, stepping forward tentatively. He held his medical bag like a shield. "Miss Sloane, she is bleeding. If you will allow me to examine—" "Do not touch her," Rafe growled. The menace in his voice made the doctor recoil. "You watched them drag her into a cell. You watched them beat her. You did nothing. You will not touch her now." Rafe swept Abby up into his arms, carrying her as easily as if she were a sack of feathers. He did not ask for permission. He walked through the center of the square, cutting a path toward the livery stable where his horse and men were waiting. "Rafe," Abby murmured. "I can walk." "Not today," he said. "Today. You do not have to do anything." As they passed the general store, a woman, the baker's wife, stepped off the boardwalk. She looked like she wanted to speak, perhaps to apologize, but the look on Rafe's face stopped the words in her throat. She simply nodded, a jerky, humble motion, and stepped back. It was the first time Red Mesa had ever bowed to them. The ride back to the canyon was slow. The urgency of the morning had been replaced by a profound exhaustion. Pike and the other men rode guard, their rifles resting easy across their saddles. But their mood was light. They passed a bottle of whiskey back and forth, toasting the sun, the sky, and the federal marshal. Rafe rode with Abby in front of him on his stallion, his arms forming a cage of safety around her. She drifted in and out of sleep, the pain in her shoulder a dull throb that anchored her to reality. When they reached the camp, it was dusk. The news had not yet reached those who had stayed behind. The sight of the returning riders caused a momentary panic, followed by a wave of relief so palpable it felt like a physical embrace. Asha was there to meet them. She took one look at Rafe's bruised face and Abby's bloodied arm, and she began barking orders. "Water, clean linen, Pike. Take the horses. Elias, fetch the willow bark." She moved to take Abby from Rafe, but Rafe shook his head. "I will tend to her," he said. Asha looked at her nephew. She saw the way he held the white woman, not as a prize, but as a lifeline. She saw the raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes that he usually hid behind a wall of stone. She nodded, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. She turned to Elias, who was hovering anxiously. "Come, boy," Asha said. "We need to check the herd in the lower pasture. The moon is bright tonight. We will give them space." The camp seemed to understand. The noise died down. People retreated to their fires, leaving the main cabin in a respectful sphere of silence. Inside, Rafe kicked the door shut and carried Abby to the narrow bed. He lit the oil lamp, the golden light chasing away the shadows of the gallows. He poured water into a basin and set it on the small table. "Sit up," he said gently. Abby swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She winced as she tried to unbutton her dress. Her right arm was stiff and useless. "Let me," Rafe said. His hands, usually so lethal, were shaking slightly. He undid the buttons of her bodice with agonizing slowness, peeling the fabric back to reveal her shoulder. It was swollen and blue, and the cut on her forearm was angry and red. He took a cloth soaked in warm water and began to clean the blood. He did not speak. He worked with a concentration that was almost religious. Abby watched him. She traced the line of his jaw, the bruise blooming on his cheekbone where Boone had struck him. "You are shaking," she whispered. Rafe paused. He dropped the cloth into the basin. He rested his hands on his knees and hung his head, his long hair falling forward to curtain his face. "I thought I was going to die today," Rafe said, his voice low and hollow. "I have faced death 100 times. Abby, it never scared me. A bullet, a knife, a rope. It is just the end." He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet. "But when I saw you standing on that wagon, when I saw Boone aim his gun at you," his voice cracked, "I knew fear. True fear. It turned my blood to ice. If he had pulled that trigger, Abigail, if you had fallen," he could not finish the sentence. He reached out and took her good hand, pressing it to his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating, a frantic, powerful rhythm against his ribs. "I have spent 30 years convincing myself I needed no one," Rafe confessed. "I thought being alone was strength, but standing on that platform, looking at you, I realized I have been weak my whole life because I was too afraid to have something to lose." Abby's heart ached for him. She understood that fear. She had lived her own version of it, the fear of hoping, the fear of believing she could be more than a shadow in someone else's kitchen. "I was afraid too," Abby whispered. "Not of the gun. I was afraid that I would never get to tell you." "Tell me what?" Rafe asked, leaning closer. "That I am not just cooking for the job anymore," she said, a tear slipping down her dusty cheek. "That when I look in the mirror now, I do not see the rejected woman. I see the woman you look at, and that makes me feel worthy." Rafe let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He moved his hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing away the tear. "You were always worthy. Abby, you just needed a better mirror." He leaned in. The distance between them closed. It was not a frantic collision, but a slow, inevitable gravity. When his lips touched hers, it was soft. It tasted of survival. It tasted of the smoke from the campfire and the salt of their tears. It was a kiss of acknowledgement, a silent vow made in the quiet dark of the mountains. He deepened the kiss, his hand sliding to the back of her neck, careful of her injured shoulder. Abby sighed into his mouth, her good arm wrapping around his waist, pulling him closer. There was no rush, no desperate groping. It was a slow exploration of this new reality where they were both alive, both safe, and both seen. Rafe pulled back just an inch, resting his forehead against hers. Their breath mingled in the cool air. "I will never let them touch you again," he swore. "I will burn the world down first." "No burning," Abby murmured, closing her eyes. "Just stay right here." "I am not going anywhere," Rafe said. He blew out the lamp. The cabin was plunged into darkness. But for the first time in her life, Abby did not feel the cold. The wind howled outside, battering the walls. But inside, there was only the warmth of the man who had learned to love her, and the steady, reassuring beat of two hearts that had finally found their rhythm. The sun rose the next morning with a brilliance that mocked the grim events of the previous day. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, the kind that promised a harsh winter but offered a beautiful present. The camp was already awake when Abby emerged from the cabin. Her arm was in a sling fashioned from one of Rafe's old shirts, but she had insisted on getting up. "A cook does not sleep in when there are mouths to feed," she had told Rafe when he tried to order her back to bed. The mood in the camp had changed. The tension of the siege was gone, replaced by a bustling, purposeful energy. Men were repairing the corral fences, Women were stretching their hides. Children were playing a game with sticks and a hoop near the stream. When they saw Abby, the activity paused. Pike took off his hat. A young Cheyenne woman smiled and touched her heart. It was a quiet, profound respect. Abby walked to the fire pit. Elias had already started the fire and was struggling to lift a heavy bucket of water. "Let me get that, boy." Rafe's voice boomed. Rafe stepped past Abby, picked up the heavy bucket with one hand, and poured it into the cauldron. It was a simple domestic act, hauling water, but for the war chief of the Two Moons gang, it was a statement. He was serving the camp, just as she did. He looked at Abby over the rising steam and winked. A flush warmed her cheeks, but she smiled back, cracking an egg into the skillet with one hand. "Breakfast is late," she announced, trying to sound stern. "If you want biscuits, someone needs to mix the dough. I am one-handed today." 3 men jumped forward to volunteer, stumbling over each other. Pike shoved them aside. "I will do it." Pike grunted. "My grandmother taught me, though she would likely whip me for the lumps." Laughter rippled through the camp. It was a sound that had been missing for too long. Mid-morning brought a strange sight. The sentry on the ridge whistled, signaling an approach, but not an attack. A wagon was winding its way up the trail. It was not the marshal, and it was not the army. It was a merchant wagon from Red Mesa. Rafe walked out to meet it, his hand resting on his gun. Old habits dying hard. Abby stood beside him. The wagon stopped. The driver was Mr. Henderson, the owner of the saloon where Abby had worked. Beside him sat the owner of the general store. They looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats under the gaze of the camp. "Mr. Two Moons," Henderson said, clearing his throat nervously. "Miss Sloane." "Mr. Henderson," Abby said. "You are a long way from your tap room. We brought some things." The store owner stammered. "We heard about the fire, the storm. We thought you might need supplies." He gestured to the back of the wagon. There were sacks of white flour, barrels of sugar, a crate of coffee, and bolts of clean calico cloth. "Is this a charity?" Rafe asked, his voice cool. "It is an apology," Henderson said, looking at his hands. "For everything. For the way things were. For Boone. For believing the lies." He looked at Abby. "And for the rent. Abby, Mrs. Higgins sent your quilt back. She cleaned it herself." He handed a folded bundle down. It was Abby's mother's quilt, laundered and folded neatly. Abby took it. Her throat felt tight. It was not total forgiveness. Scars did not fade overnight, but it was a bridge. "Thank you," Abby said. "We will take the flour and the coffee." Pike gets grumpy without coffee. The tension broke. The store owner smiled weakly. They unloaded the wagon, leaving the goods by the storehouse. As they turned to leave, Henderson tipped his hat to Rafe. "You are a hard man." "Two Moons," Henderson said. "But I reckon you are an honest one. If you ever need, well, if you come to town, the first round is at the house." Rafe nodded. "Drive safe. Henderson, the road is washing out near the bend," as the wagon rumbled away. Rafe stood watching the dust settle. He looked at the sacks of flour, then at the camp, then at the mountains that had been his fortress and his prison. Later that afternoon, Rafe sat on the ridge overlooking the valley. He was cleaning his revolver, the metal gleaming in the sun. Asha came up behind him. She moved silently, as she always did, sitting down on a rock nearby. "The men are talking," Asha said. "They say the marshal will clear your name in Santa Fe. They say we might get the treaty papers signed properly this time." "Papers are just paper," Rafe muttered. "They can tear them up whenever they want." "You are thinking about the future," Asha observed. "I am thinking about the past," Rafe corrected. "I look at my hands, and I see blood. Years of it. I look at Abby, and I see light. Can a man who has lived in the dark for so long really step into that light without blinding himself? Can a gunfighter be a husband? A father?" He spun the cylinder of the revolver. It clicked rhythmically. I nearly got her killed. Asha, because I am who I am. She nearly got herself killed because she is who she is, Asha said sharply. Do not take all the credit for her bravery. Nephew? She reached out and put her hand over the gun, stopping his fidgeting. Our ancestors were warriors, Asha said. But what is a warrior? Rafe, is he just a killer? No, a killer takes life. A warrior defends it. A warrior hunts to feed the tribe. He builds the shelter to keep the winter out. He tells the stories to the children so they know who they are. She squeezed his hand. You have spent 10 years fighting against the world. Maybe it is time you started fighting for a home. That does not make you weak. It makes you complete. Rafe looked at her. The wisdom of the older woman settled over him like a warm blanket. She is stubborn, Rafe said, a smile tugging at his lips. She is fierce, Asha corrected. She cooks with the same fire you shoot with. She is your match. Rafe, do not be a fool and let her go just because you are afraid of being happy. That evening, Rafe found Abby by the stream. She was watching the water rush over the stones, the setting sun turning the droplets into diamonds. He stood beside her. For a long time, they just listened to the water. The marshal sent a rider, Rafe said. The charges are dropped, all of them, even the old ones. They are calling it service to the territory, for exposing McGraw. That is good, Abby said. You are a free man. Free. Rafe repeated the word, tasting it. I can go anywhere. I could go north, to Canada. I could go to California. Abby felt a cold stone drop in her stomach. Is that what you want to leave? Rafe turned to her. He took her good hand in his. I want to go into town, he said. Abby blinked. Town. I want to walk down the main street of Red Mesa, Rafe said. In the daylight, not hiding in the shadows, not looking over my shoulder. I want to walk down that street with you on my arm. I want to buy you a dress that isn't stained with flour. I want to sit on a porch and watch the sun go down, without wondering who is aiming at my back. He looked at her with a vulnerability that broke her heart. I am tired of the dark. Abby, I want to live in the light, with you. If you will have a retired outlaw with a bad reputation and a lot of scars. Abby squeezed his hand. She looked at this man, the most feared man in town, who was offering her the one thing she had always wanted, a place to belong. I will walk with you. Rafe, Abby said. I will walk anywhere with you. She paused, her eyes flashing with that stubborn spark he loved. But I have conditions. Rafe raised an eyebrow. Conditions. I am not going to be just a wife who sits in the parlor and embroiders cushions, Abby said firmly. I am a cook. It is who I am. I want to feed people. Not just the camp, not just the town. Both. I want a place where Pike can sit next to the banker, and they both have to eat my stew or get out. Rafe laughed. It was a full, deep sound that echoed off the canyon walls. A place where the worlds meet, he said. It will make the politicians nervous. Good, Abby said. Let them be nervous, as long as they are hungry. Rafe pulled her close, kissing her forehead. Done, he said. We will build it, together. The sun dipped below the horizon, but the darkness did not feel threatening anymore. It felt like a curtain falling on a long, hard act, preparing the stage for something new, something hopeful, something that smelled of sage, wood smoke, and the promise of a meal shared in peace. 6 months had passed since the gallows had stood empty in the square of Red Mesa, and the wind that swept down from the Dragoon Mountains no longer carried the scent of impending violence. It carried the smell of sagebrush, the dust of the turning season, and, if the breeze was right, the undeniable, mouth-watering aroma of slow-roasted beef and caramelized onions. The telegram from the federal marshal had arrived on a Tuesday, delivered to the sheriff's office, which was now occupied by a temporary deputy from Santa Fe until a permanent replacement could be elected. The news spread through the valley faster than a brush fire. Silas McGraw had been convicted by a federal court in St. Louis. The charges of grand larceny, conspiracy, and corruption had stuck like burrs to wool. He was sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. his assets seized by the government to pay restitution to the railroad investors and the local populace. But the most important piece of paper was not the sentencing order. It was the new survey map. The Department of the Interior, under pressure from the Marshal's report and perhaps fearing the bad publicity of a range war, had redrawn the lines. The fertile valley floor, the winter grazing grounds of Rafe's ancestors, was formally recognized as protected territory. The railroad would still come through. Progress was an iron beast that could not be stopped entirely, but the route had been shifted 2 miles north, over rockier ground. Furthermore, the Pacific Union Company, stripped of McGraw's influence, had signed a contract agreeing to hire local labor for the construction. That meant paychecks for the men of the Two Moons camp. It meant paychecks for the unemployed miners of Red Mesa. It meant that for the first time in a decade, the two sides were swinging hammers at spikes instead of swinging fists at each other. On a stretch of land that sat exactly on the border between the town limits and the reservation line, a new building had risen. It was not a canvas tent, nor was it a dark, smoky saloon. It was a solid structure made of peeled pine logs and adobe bricks, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, large glass windows, expensive, imported all the way from Denver, let the sunlight pour in. Above the double doors swung a wooden sign, hand-carved and burned with a branding iron, Two Moons Table. Inside, the lunch rush was in full swing. The space was chaotic, loud, and miraculously harmonious. At one long table, a group of railroad surveyors in dusty suits sat shoulder to shoulder with 3 Cheyenne cattle drovers. They were passing a basket of cornbread back and forth, arguing not about land rights, but about whether the coffee was hot enough. At another table, Mrs. Sterling, the very woman who had once shielded her daughter's eyes from Abby, was carefully eating a slice of peach pie, nodding politely to Pike, who was devouring a bowl of chili at the next table over. The air was thick with the smell of comfort, rosemary, garlic, wood smoke, and the sweet tang of molasses filled the room. In the middle of it all moved Abigail Sloane. She was not the cowering woman who had peddled scraps in the market. She wore a dress of deep blue calico, crisp and clean, with a white apron that was tied smartly at her waist. Her hair was no longer pulled back severely. It was loose enough to frame her face, softening the angles that the town had once called plain. She carried a heavy tray loaded with steaming plates, weaving through the tables with the grace of a dancer and the authority of a general. "More biscuits for table 4, Abby called out toward the kitchen pass. "And Pike, if you spill chili on that tablecloth again, you are washing it." "Yes, ma'am," Pike grumbled, though he wiped his mouth with a grin. Elias, the orphan boy who had once looked at the world with terrified eyes, darted between the chairs. He was dressed in a clean shirt and trousers, holding a pitcher of lemonade. "Señor," Elias said to a Mexican vaquero, pouring the drink with a flourish. Then he turned to a white rancher. "More water, sir." He switched between English, Spanish, and Cheyenne effortlessly. A living bridge between the worlds that gathered under this roof. He was saving every penny of his tips in a tin can hidden under the floorboards. He told everyone who would listen that one day he would build the finest way station in the territory, with fresh horses and beds that did not have fleas. The door opened, and the room quieted just a fraction, a respectful hush that acknowledged authority. Rafe. Two Moons walked in. He still wore the dust coat. He still wore the colt on his hip. He was still a man who took up space, whose very presence demanded attention. But the darkness that had once shrouded him like a cloak was gone. He was no longer the most feared man in town. He had become something more complex and perhaps more important. He was the mediator. When cattle from the Star Cross Ranch wandered onto tribal land, the ranchers did not ride out with guns blazing anymore. They rode to the cookhouse and asked for Rafe. When a young Cheyenne brave got too drunk and broke a window in town, the sheriff did not drag him to a cell. He sent for Rafe. Rafe settled disputes with a low voice and a hard look, reminding everyone of the violence that lived just beneath the surface of the piece, and why it was better to keep it buried. He walked up to the counter where Abby was tallying a bill. He took off his hat, shaking the dust from the brim. "Trouble at the depot?" Abby asked without looking up, her pencil moving quickly over the paper. Just a dispute about wages, Rafe said, leaning his elbows on the counter. The foreman tried to short the Cheyenne crew. I reminded him that a railroad tie is heavy, but a grievance is heavier. Did he listen? He paid them, Rafe said simply. And he bought a round of drinks. Abby looked up then. Her eyes met his. 6 months ago, a look like that would have been stolen, fraught with danger. Now, it was open, warm, and filled with a shared language of intimacy. Hungry? She asked. Always, Rafe replied. But not for stew. I need to ride out to the ridge. The new fencing is going up. Take a pie, Abby said, reaching under the counter to produce a small apple turnover wrapped in brown paper. And take Elias. He needs to learn how to string wire. Rafe took the pie. His fingers brushed hers, lingering for a second. You are a hard woman. Abigail Sloane, slave labor and cold pie. Hot pie, she corrected. And it is not slave labor if he is learning a trade. Go. He winked at her, put his hat back on, and signaled to Elias. The boy's face lit up, and he abandoned his pitcher to trot after his hero. Abby watched them go, a profound sense of peace settling in her chest. She looked out the window at the red mountains rising in the distance. They were the same mountains that had terrified her on that first journey up the trail. Now, they looked like guardians. The afternoon wore on. The lunch crowd thinned, replaced by travelers coming off the stagecoach. A stranger entered, a man in a pinstripe suit carrying a leather satchel, a salesman from the east. Judging by his shoes, he looked around the rustic but clean establishment with an air of skeptical appraisal. He sat at a corner table. Abby walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. Welcome to Two Moons' table, she said. Coffee is fresh. The stew is venison. The man looked her up and down. He did not see the queen of the kitchen. He saw a woman in her late 20s with rough hands and a face that had seen too much sun. Venison, the man sniffed. A bit primitive, isn't it, I suppose, out here in the wilderness? One cannot expect culinary refinement. One can expect a full belly, Abby said politely. Which is more than you will get complaining about the menu. The man chuckled, a condescending sound. Spirited. I like that. Tell me, Miss, surely a woman of your domestic talents, has a husband back there in the kitchen doing the heavy lifting? I own this place, Abby said. Indeed. The man raised an eyebrow. Hard for a woman alone out here, especially one who, well, let us be honest, relies on her cooking rather than her charm to bring the customers in. He meant it as a joke, a ribald comment about her looks. A year ago, Abby would have withered. She would have stared at her shoes, felt the heat of shame burn her neck, and retreated to the safety of the shadows. But the shadows were gone. Abby smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was the smile of a woman who had ridden through a sandstorm, broken a man out of jail, and stared down the barrel of a gun. You are right, sir, Abby said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. Charm is fleeting. A good brisket takes 12 hours. The door opened behind her. Rafe had returned for a forgotten coil of rope. He stood in the doorway, filling the frame, his presence instantly changing the temperature of the room. He heard the man's comment. His eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward, his hand dropping instinctively to his belt. Abby saw him. She raised a hand, a small gesture that stopped him in his tracks. I have got this. She turned back to the salesman, who had suddenly become very pale as he noticed the giant figure looming by the door. Besides, Abby continued, her voice bright and amused, a customer once told me something similar. Oh, the salesman squeaked, looking nervously at Rafe. Yes, Abby said. She looked over her shoulder at Rafe. He was watching her, a slow, proud smirk spreading across his face. I told the most feared man in town I wasn't pretty, Abby said, her eyes locking with Rafe's. And he proved I was wrong every single day. The salesman looked from the formidable man in the doorway to the confident woman with the dish rag. He swallowed hard. I will have the stew, he whispered. Excellent choice, Abby said. She walked back to the counter, passing Rafe. As she did, he leaned down and whispered in her ear, "You are vain, Mrs. 2 Moons." "I am accurate, Mr. 2 Moons," she retorted. "And wash your boots before you come in." "I just mopped." Rafe laughed, and the sound seemed to chase the last of the dust out of the corners of the room. Night fell over the high desert. The cookhouse was closed, the last lamp extinguished. The silence of the wilderness reclaimed the land, vast and indifferent and beautiful. On the wide wooden porch, Rafe and Abby sat on a swinging bench he had built from cedar wood. The air was cooling rapidly, but a heavy buffalo robe was spread over their laps. Rafe had one arm draped along the back of the bench, his fingers playing idly with a loose strand of Abby's hair. Abby rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the rhythmic chirping of the crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Above them, the Milky Way was a smear of diamond dust across the black velvet sky. It was a view that cost nothing, yet was worth more than all the gold Silas McGraw had tried to steal. "Elias wants to buy that roan mare from the livery," Rafe said softly. "He has saved $12. "He is a good boy," Abby said. "He works hard. Maybe we should help him with the rest." "He wants to do it himself," Rafe said. "He has pride, like his mother." Abby smiled in the dark. "We are going to need another room soon," she said. "If we are going to take in travelers." "We can build it in the spring," Rafe said. "I was thinking, maybe not just for travelers." Abby lifted her head to look at him. "What do you mean?" Rafe looked out at the dark horizon. "There are a lot of kids out there, Abby. Kids from the reservation who lost parents in the sickness. Kids from town whose fathers died in the mines. Strays, like we were." He looked down at her. "We have the space, we have the food. And God knows you have enough bossiness to manage a regiment." Abby felt a lump form in her throat. It was a dream she had never dared to articulate, not even to herself, to fill a house not just with customers, but with family. "A home for strays," Abby whispered. "A home," Rafe corrected. He took her hand, the hand that was rough, scarred, and stained with flour, and interlaced his fingers with hers. His grip was warm and solid. "I cannot promise you it will be easy, Abigail," Rafe said seriously. "The world is still hard. There will be bad years, droughts, winters where the wood runs low, people who will still look at us with hate." "I know," Abby said. "I do not want easy. I want something real." "Then we will face it," Rafe said. "Whatever comes, storms, sheriffs, or hungry children." Abby leaned up and kissed him. It was a slow, lingering kiss, full of the comfort of knowing that the search was over. She had found her place. She was not the rejected woman in the market square anymore. She was the heart of this valley. She was the fire that kept the darkness at bay. Rafe pulled her closer, wrapping the buffalo robe tighter around them. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the sky. A shooting star streaked across the darkness, burning bright and fierce before vanishing behind the silhouette of the Dragoon Mountains. "Make a wish," Rafe said. Abby rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She looked at the star, at the mountains, at the hand holding hers. "I do not need to," Abby said softly. "I already have everything I cooked for." The wind blew across the desert, carrying the scent of cooling sage and the eternal silence of the west. It whispered through the cracks in the logs of the house they had built, a song of resilience and redemption. And there, on the porch of the 2 Moons table, the most feared man in town and the woman who had tamed him sat together, watching the night watch over them, ready for the morning sun. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Abby and Rafe. It has been a long journey from the dusty streets of Red Mesa to the warmth of their new home, and I am truly grateful you rode along with us. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these tales travel. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Don't forget to hit the like button and press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support keeps the campfire burning and the stories coming. Until next time, happy trails.